Silent Hill 4, The Room, a Retrospective. Tonight, we're going to talk about the game that shouldn't have been a Silent Hill game at all, a project that began as something else entirely, transformed mid-development into the fourth entry of a beloved franchise, and became perhaps the most divisive, experimental, and misunderstood game Team Silent would ever create. This is about Silent Hill 4, The Room, released in 2004, a game that broke away from almost everything the series had established, looked inward rather than outward, and asked what horror means when you can't escape your own apartment. Get comfortable. We're going to spend the next few hours examining every corner of Room 302, following Walter Sullivan through his 21 sacraments, and understanding why this strange, flawed, fascinating game represents both the peak of Team Silent's ambition and the beginning of the franchise's long decline. This won't be a quick retrospective. We're going deep, moving slowly through the development history, the gameplay systems, the symbolism, the connections to previous games, and the legacy that still divides fans 2 decades later. Silent Hill 4 arrived at a pivotal moment. The series had peaked critically with Silent Hill 2 in 2001, delivered the commercially successful Silent Hill 3 in 2003, and now Team Silent was trying something radically different. The result was a game that fascinated some players, frustrated others, and left almost everyone uncertain about what they just experienced. To understand why, we need to go back to where it began. The context. Team Silent's final chapter. By 2003, Team Silent had established Silent Hill as PlayStation's answer to Resident Evil, but with a crucial difference where Capcom's franchise thrived on action and biological horror, Konami's series explored psychological terror and emotional depth. Silent Hill 2 had proven that horror games could be literary, could tackle themes of guilt, grief, and trauma with genuine sophistication. Silent Hill 3 continued Alessa and Harry's story while refining the technical aspects, delivering the most visually impressive entry yet. But Team Silent was changing. Key members were leaving or being reassigned. Keiichiro Toyama, director of the first game, had already departed after Silent Hill 1. Masahiro Ito, the creature designer whose work defined the series' visual identity, was still present, but his role was evolving. The team that created Silent Hill 4 was different from the one that made Silent Hill 2, working under different pressures with different goals. Development on what would become Silent Hill 4 began around 2002, shortly after Silent Hill 2's release. The initial concept wasn't for a Silent Hill game at all. Team Silent wanted to create an experimental horror title that focused on a single location, an apartment, and the psychological breakdown of isolation. The idea was to make a game about being trapped, about a space that should feel safe becoming hostile, about watching your sanctuary decay around you while you're powerless to stop it. Konami's management saw potential but wanted the project tied to their successful franchise. The decision was made to retrofit the concept into Silent Hill's mythology, connecting it to the town's curse and integrating it with established lore. This wasn't seamless. You can feel the seams in the final product, places where Silent Hill 4's original vision pushes against the franchise framework it was forced into. But you can also see how this tension created something unique, a game that exists both within and outside Silent Hill's established rules. The development team faced technical transitions as well. Silent Hill 4 was being built for PlayStation 2, but unlike previous entries that were PS2 exclusives, this game was designed for multi-platform release from the start. PS2, Xbox, and PC would all receive versions. This required engine modifications and design compromises that previous games hadn't needed to consider. The result was a game that looked slightly different from Silent Hill 3, less technically polished in some areas, but more ambitious in scope. Director Suguru Murakoshi approached the project with a specific vision. He wanted to create a horror game where the protagonist wasn't actively exploring a haunted town, but was instead a prisoner in his own home, forced to venture into nightmare worlds to understand why he couldn't escape. This was conceptually brilliant. Most horror games send you into danger, but what if danger was keeping you home, making the place you should feel safest the most terrifying location? The apartment concept had precedent in horror cinema. Roman Polanski's Repulsion and The Tenant both explored psychological breakdown within confined domestic spaces. David Lynch's work, particularly Eraserhead, understood how ordinary apartments could become surreal prisons. Barton Fink trapped its protagonist in a hotel room where reality deteriorated. Team Silent was drawing from a rich tradition of claustrophobic horror, but translating it to an interactive medium presented challenges these films never faced. Silent Hill 4 released in Japan on June 17, 2004, followed by North American release on September 7, 2004, and European release on September 17, 2004. The game arrived to mixed reviews and divided fan response. Some praised its ambition and innovation. Others criticized its departure from series conventions and its gameplay frustrations. Almost everyone agreed it was strange, but whether that strangeness was brilliant or misguided depended on who you asked. What's clear now, 20 years later, is that Silent Hill 4 was Team Silent's final complete game. After this, the team would be dissolved, key members would leave Konami, and future Silent Hill games would be developed by different studios in different countries with different philosophies. Silent Hill 4 represents the end of an era, the last time the original creative vision would be fully realized. This makes examining it both a critical evaluation of the game itself and an autopsy of what Team Silent had become by 2004. The premise, Room 302, South Ashfield Heights. The game opens with a nightmare. Henry Townsend wakes in his apartment, Room 302 of South Ashfield Heights, a modest one-bedroom unit in a building located in Ashfield, a city distinct from but connected to Silent Hill. He's been trapped inside for 5 days. The doors chained from the inside, somehow impossibly secured by chains he couldn't have installed himself. The windows won't break. The phone line is dead. Neighbors pass by his door, audible through the walls, but when he shouts for help, they don't respond. He watches through his peephole as people come and go, living normal lives while he's sealed in this impossible prison. Henry is an unremarkable man. He's 28 years old, works as a photographer, and by all accounts was living an ordinary life before this began. He's quiet, introverted, not particularly athletic or brave. He's the kind of protagonist Team Silent had perfected since the first game, a regular person thrust into extraordinary horror, unprepared and overwhelmed. But where Harry Mason searched for his daughter and James Sunderland sought his dead wife, Henry isn't searching for anything. He just wants to leave his apartment. The game's opening hours is masterful psychological horror. You're in a normal apartment, small kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, living room. Everything looks right. The furniture is ordinary, the layout is mundane. Nothing suggests supernatural threat, but you can't leave. The apartment becomes oppressive through its normalcy. Other horror games put you in mansions, or hospitals, or haunted towns. Silent Hill 4 traps you somewhere that should feel safe, then makes that safety into a cage. As you explore the apartment, you find messages. Someone has scratched words into the walls, hidden beneath wallpaper, or behind furniture. The messages are cryptic, desperate. Don't go out. The room is a portal. Someone, please help me. They're signed by Joseph Schreiber, the previous tenant of room 302. Henry didn't know this person, didn't know anything unusual about the apartment's history, but clearly something happened here, something that connects to his current imprisonment. The turning point comes when a hole opens in the bathroom wall, not a crack or a damaged section, a hole that appears between one moment and the next, pulsing at the edges like an organic wound, bleeding slightly, radiating wrongness. Looking through reveals nothing but darkness and a faint glow beyond. This is horror that defies rational explanation. Apartments don't develop supernatural holes. Reality doesn't work this way, but Henry has no other options. He's been trapped for 5 days with dwindling food and water. The hole might be escape, it might be doom, but staying guarantees nothing changes. When Henry crawls through, he emerges into another world entirely. Not the hallway outside his apartment, not the building's lobby, but a subway station. Not a normal subway. This is Silent Hill's other world. Though Henry doesn't know that yet. The trains are rusted and abandoned. The platforms are empty, and in the shadows things move, things that aren't human. The nightmare has expanded beyond room 302, but the apartment remains the nexus, the only safe harbor in the storm. This structure, apartment as safe hub, other worlds as dangerous exploration zones, defines Silent Hill 4's gameplay loop. You venture into nightmare realms, gather clues, solve puzzles, confront horrors, then return to room 302 to save your progress and prepare for the next excursion. The apartment is your sanctuary, your save point, your inventory storage, and increasingly your prison. Because as the game progresses, the apartment itself begins changing. The changes start subtly. Items move when you're not looking. Furniture appears that wasn't there before. More messages from Joseph Schreiber manifest, appearing in places you've already checked. Then the hauntings intensify. Ghosts begin appearing, victims you'll learn about later, people who died in specific ways, now trapped in room 302. They can't be killed, only temporarily subdued. They follow you from room to room, draining your health through proximity. The apartment, your only refuge, becomes actively hostile. This inversion is Silent Hill 4's core innovation. Previous games made safe rooms genuinely safe. Resident Evil's save rooms were sanctuaries. Silent Hill's save points were secure. Breaking this rule creates profound unease. You return to your apartment for relief after surviving the subway world, but now there's a ghost in your bedroom. You need to access your storage chest, but crossing the living room means taking damage. The game has poisoned your sanctuary, made home into threat. The apartment's layout matters psychologically. It's small enough that you learn every inch intimately. You know exactly where each room is, what each corner contains, how long it takes to walk from door to bathroom. This familiarity makes changes deeply unsettling. When a ghost appears in the bathroom, you notice immediately because you know that space. When new chains manifest in the bedroom, they're violations of geometry you've internalized. The apartment becomes a character, a presence that watches and judges and transforms according to rules you can't predict. Room 302's history is gradually revealed. The apartment building, South Ashfield Heights, is about 3 hours from Silent Hill by car. It's an ordinary residential building with no obvious supernatural properties. But room 302 specifically has a dark past tied to Walter Sullivan, a serial killer who committed suicide in the room 10 years before Henry moved in. Walter's connection to Silent Hill's cult, to specific rituals, to the very concept of what room meant to him, all of this explains why room 302 has become a nexus of supernatural horror. The game's structure alternates between apartment sequences and otherworld exploration. You enter holes that appear in different locations: bathroom wall, bedroom wall, eventually other spots as the apartment opens up like a wound. Each hole leads to a distinct world: subway, forest, water prison, building, hospital. These aren't random nightmares, but locations significant to Walter Sullivan's life and crimes. Understanding this requires assembling narrative fragments from notes, diary entries, newspaper clippings, and the testimony of other characters you encounter. This fragmented storytelling was classic Silent Hill, but Silent Hill 4 pushed it further than previous games. Where Silent Hill 2 eventually explained James's guilt directly, Silent Hill 4 maintains ambiguity longer, requires more player assembly, trusts you to connect dots that aren't always obvious. This frustrated some players who wanted clearer answers, but it also rewarded close attention and repeat playthroughs. The apartment's significance extends beyond being a hub. It's the literal center of Walter's ritual, the mother he seeks to be reborn into. This concept, that Walter, abandoned as a child and raised by the cult in this very room, imprinted on the apartment as a parent figure, is deeply disturbing and profoundly sad simultaneously. The horror comes from understanding that Walter's crimes are rooted in childhood trauma, in being taught by his cult upbringing that love means sacrifice and birth requires death. Walter Sullivan, architect of the 21 Sacraments. To understand Silent Hill 4, you must understand Walter Sullivan. He's referenced in Silent Hill 2. Newspaper clippings mention a serial killer who murdered children and adults in Silent Hill and Ashfield, then killed himself in his prison cell. Silent Hill 4 expands this reference into a complete character study, transforming Walter from background lore into the game's central antagonist and tragic figure. Walter Sullivan was born in 1969 to parents who immediately abandoned him. He was found as an infant in room 302 of South Ashfield Heights and taken into the care of St. Jerome's Hospital. From there he was transferred to Hope House Orphanage, an institution run by the Order, Silent Hill's cult. Hope House wasn't a normal orphanage. It was a recruitment and indoctrination facility where vulnerable children were groomed to serve the cult's purposes. The Order taught Walter their twisted theology, that paradise could be achieved through suffering, that gods could be born through ritual sacrifice, that the world needed to be cleansed and remade. They told him that room 302, where he'd been found, was his mother, the only parent he'd ever had, the sacred womb he'd been born from. This wasn't metaphor to Walter. He internalized it completely. The apartment was literally his mother, and his purpose was to return to her, to be reborn through her, to complete the cycle. The cult taught him the 21 Sacraments, a ritual requiring 21 murders in specific configurations, following symbolic patterns tied to tarot, numerology, and their perverted understanding of rebirth. Walter, conditioned since childhood, accepted this mission with zealot fervor. He would kill 21 victims, including himself, to complete the ritual and be reborn as their god servant or perhaps as a god himself. The theology was deliberately unclear, layers of cult doctrine that Walter may not have fully understood, but followed with absolute conviction. Walter's murders began in the late 1980s or early 1990s. The timeline is somewhat ambiguous, but by the time of Silent Hill 2's events in 2001, Walter is established lore. His killing spree spanned years, targeting specific individuals who fit the ritual requirements. Each victim represented one of the 21 sacraments, each killing performed in locations and manners dictated by the ritual's structure. The victims weren't random, Walter chose them based on symbolic significance. The first sacrament was temptation. Cynthia Velasquez, a woman he murdered in the subway, representing worldly desire. The second was hollow. Bobby Randolph, killed in the subway's opposite side, representing emptiness. The third and fourth were twins, representing two sides of the same coin. The pattern continued, each victim fulfilling a specific role in Walter's cosmology. After 10 victims, Walter arranged his own death, Sacrament 11. He carved numbers into his victims' flesh, including his own, marking them as ritual components. His suicide wasn't escape, it was part of the plan. By dying in room 302, while the ritual was incomplete, he ensured his spirit would remain tethered to the apartment, able to continue the sacraments from beyond death. This is horror rooted in genuine magical thinking. Walter believed so completely that he made the impossible real through sheer conviction. His ghost, or spirit, or whatever Walter became after death, continued the killing. Victims 12 through 20 were murdered by this undead Walter, appearing in his childhood form, a boy, innocent looking but dead eyed, carrying out brutal killings with the methodical efficiency of someone following instructions. These later murders occurred in 1999, shortly before Henry Townsend moved into room 302. The final victim before Henry's arrival was Eric Walsh, who had been researching the old murders and stumbled too close to the truth. Walter's appearance in the game is unsettling. As a child, he wears shorts, a t-shirt, and a blank expression. He moves stiffly, speaks in a monotone, asks, "Is this it?" when he approaches, whether asking if he's found the next victim or if the ritual is finally complete is unclear. As an adult, he appears after Sacrament 17, wearing a coat and the calm demeanor of someone who's achieved peace through terrible means. Both forms are disturbing, but the child Walter is worse because innocence and murder shouldn't coexist. The psychological profile of Walter Sullivan is tragic. He's a victim of cult conditioning, of being taught from infancy that his worth depended on completing this ritual, that the only love available to him was the love of an apartment he'd been found in. The order destroyed him, turned a vulnerable child into a weapon. But this doesn't excuse his crimes. The people he murdered suffered, their families destroyed, their lives ended to fuel Walter's delusion. Silent Hill 4 asks you to understand Walter without forgiving him, to see his tragedy without absolving his evil. This complexity makes Walter one of Team Silent's best antagonists. He's not a monster in the traditional sense. He's a broken person doing monstrous things because he was broken by others who shaped him to this purpose. Previous Silent Hill games gave you relatively straightforward villains. Dahlia Gillespie was a zealot. Claudia Wolf was a fanatic. Walter is those things, but also a victim, also a child who never had a chance, also a human being somewhere beneath the conditioning. The ritual itself, the 21 sacraments, draws from multiple symbolic systems. The number 21 appears in tarot, 21 cards in the major arcana plus the Fool. In numerology, 21 is 2 plus 1 more 3, representing completion and wholeness. The victims are arranged in patterns, the first 10 killed in locations around Silent Hill and Ashfield, Walter himself as number 11. The second set of 10 in specific otherworld locations tied to Walter's past, and the final victim, number 21, intended to be someone trapped in room 302, someone who would die there and complete the cycle. Each sacrament has a name and symbolic meaning: temptation, source, spiral, watchfulness. These aren't arbitrary. They're drawn from the cult's theology, from Walter's understanding of the universe filtered through years of indoctrination. The game presents the sacrament names without always explaining them. trusting players to feel their weight even if the precise meaning remains obscure. This ambiguity is intentional. Cults don't offer clarity, they offer the illusion of meaning wrapped in incomprehensible doctrine. Walter's belief that room 302 is his mother is the emotional core of the ritual. He's not just killing to achieve power or serve a god. He's trying to return home, to be held by the only parent he remembers, to complete a birth that was interrupted when he was abandoned. This maternal language pervades his dialogue. He calls the apartment mother. He speaks about being reborn. He sees the ritual as pregnancy and birth, himself as the child being delivered into paradise. This psychosexual element, the apartment as mother, the ritual as pregnancy, death as birth, is deeply disturbing but psychologically coherent within Walter's damaged worldview. Team Silent was drawing from real cult psychology, where members often describe their groups in familial terms and rituals in reproductive metaphors. Heaven's Gate, the People's Temple, Children of God, all use this language. Walter's belief isn't invented horror, it's horror rooted in genuine cultist rhetoric. The game's challenge is that you're trying to stop Walter from completing the ritual, but by the time Henry becomes involved, 16 sacraments are already complete. You're not preventing the killings, you're trying to survive being targeted for the final spaces in Walter's design. The inevitability is oppressive. Walter has been working toward this for decades. He's dead, but still hunting. He's unstoppable in any conventional sense. Your only advantage is that he's following rules, ritual rules that might provide the loopholes necessary for survival. The worlds, geography of trauma. The holes in room 302 lead to distinct worlds, each corresponding to location significant in Walter Sullivan's life and ritual. These aren't random nightmare spaces, but specific places transformed by Silent Hill's curse and Walter's psychic imprint. Understanding where you are and why you're there adds layers to the horror. You're not just surviving, you're walking through Walter's memories and crimes, bearing witness to his history. The subway world. The first world Henry enters through the bathroom hole is a deserted subway station beneath Ashfield. The subway is rusted and abandoned. Trains sitting silent on the tracks, platforms empty, tunnels extending into darkness. This is where Walter committed the first two sacraments, Cynthia Velasquez in one section, Bobby Randolph in another. The subway represents transition, movement between states, the liminal space where city dwellers exist between destinations. The atmosphere is oppressive. Industrial sounds echo through corridors, metallic clangs, distant machinery, the drip of water. The lighting is harsh fluorescent, creating deep shadows in corners. Doors require keys found in unlikely places, and the enemies they emerge from shadows, monstrous forms that aren't quite human. The game introduces you to combat here, and immediately you understand Henry isn't a fighter. His pipe swings are hesitant. His aim is poor. Combat is a chore, something to avoid when possible. You encounter Cynthia Velasquez still alive? Barely. She's injured, confused, bleeding out in a subway car. She asks for help, doesn't understand what's happening. Henry tries to assist but lacks medical knowledge. Before you can save her, Walter appears, the child version, and kills Cynthia with clinical efficiency. You watch helplessly. This establishes the game's helplessness theme. You can't save everyone. You'll witness deaths you can't prevent. Walter's ritual proceeds regardless of your interference. The subway structure is maze-like. Lynch Station connects to multiple platforms, each requiring exploration. You're finding keys, solving rudimentary puzzles, encountering ghosts of previous victims. The game teaches you that ghosts are invincible. You can knock them down with limited sword attacks, but they'll rise again. The best strategy is avoidance, running past them, accepting minor damage to preserve resources. This is survival horror at its most basic. You're outmatched and must minimize engagement. The subway concludes when you locate the ritual site where Walter performed the first murders. The area is marked with candles, occult symbols, bloodstains that shouldn't still be fresh years later. Henry finds a medallion, Saint Medallion, an item tied to the ritual and necessary for understanding later worlds. The subway has served its purpose, introducing Walter, establishing his methods, teaching you the basic loop of exploration, puzzle solving, and retreating to room 302, Forest World. The second world access through a new hole in the apartment wall takes Henry to a dense forest surrounding Wish House Orphanage. This is where Walter was raised, where the cult taught him his purpose. The forest is supernatural, too dense, too dark, paths looping back on themselves illogically. You're meant to get lost, meant to feel like the environment resists escape. Wish House itself is a dilapidated structure, rooms filled with moldy furniture and disturbing remnants of the orphanage's operations. You find notes documenting the abuse, not physical violence necessarily, but psychological conditioning. Children taught that suffering is holy, isolation used as punishment, doctrines about paradise through pain. The cult's fingerprints are everywhere, explaining how Walter became what he became. The forest introduces new enemy types and a more complex puzzle structure. You're gathering ritual items, finding keys hidden in unlikely places, solving environmental puzzles that require backtracking through areas you've partially explored. The game's pacing is deliberate. You're not rushing, you're investigating, piecing together narrative through environmental storytelling. Documents found in Wish House fill in Walter's childhood, the cult's theology, the original purpose of Room 302. One particularly effective sequence involves finding Walter's old room at Wish House. It's a small space, barely more than a closet, containing a single bed, a desk, and writings Walter left as a child. The writings are disturbing. A boy describing his mother in room 302, his confusion about why he was taken away from her, his determination to return. This is a child desperate for maternal love, twisted by cult indoctrination into believing an apartment could provide it. The horror is in the sadness, the wasted potential, the innocence corrupted. The forest also contains the first of several ritual sites Walter created after escaping Wish House. These are outdoor shrines, marked with symbols drawn from the Order's iconography and Walter's personal mythology. Candles arranged in specific patterns, offerings left years ago but somehow preserved. Standing in these spaces feels wrong. You're in someone else's sacred site, a place where they performed acts they considered holy, but that resulted in murder. The forest world concludes when you locate the remains of a specific victim and retrieve another medallion. The path back to room 302 is through a final hole that appears once you've completed the ritual tasks Walter's design requires. This world-hopping structure, enter, explore, solve, gather, return, becomes the game's rhythm. Each world is a chapter, a memory, a crime scene you're walking through posthumously. Water Prison. The third major world is the Toluca Prison Water Tower, a structure near Silent Hill used to confine and punish. Walter was held here briefly as a teenager when he was first suspected of violent tendencies. The water prison is claustrophobic, metal grates for floors, water visible below, constant dripping, the sense that you're suspended above drowning. The architecture is purely functional, inhumane, designed to contain rather than rehabilitate. Enemies here are more aggressive. The game is ramping difficulty, introducing monsters that pursue relentlessly, that require combat rather than avoidance. Your weapon arsenal has expanded: pipe, pistol, eventually more exotic tools. But Henry's incompetence means every fight is costly. You take damage, you consume healing items. The resource management that defines survival horror becomes paramount. The prison world is particularly effective at creating dread through environmental design. The water below is dark, suggesting depth, making every metal grate walkway feel precarious. The cells you pass contain evidence of inmates, scratched messages, makeshift weapons, signs of violence. This was a place where people suffered officially, where the state's authority to punish was exercised with minimal oversight. Walter's time here would have reinforced his belief that the world is cruel, that suffering is universal, that his actions were just one more form of the violence that permeates existence. You find documents explaining Walter's imprisonment. He was caught attempting to break into room 302 after aging out of Wish House. He tried to explain about his mother, about needing to return home, but authorities interpreted this as delusional behavior. He was institutionalized briefly, medicated, released when he seemed stable, but the cult's conditioning was too deep. The medication couldn't erase years of being taught that his worth depended on completing the 21 sacraments. He resumed his mission as soon as he was free. The water prison also contains another living victim, Andrew DeSalvo, a businessman who represents Sacrament 16. You encounter him injured, desperate, trying to understand why he's here. Henry attempts to help, but Walter appears and kills Andrew while you're too far away to intervene. This pattern repeats. You find victims, they're lucid enough to communicate, they die before you can save them. The game is teaching you about inevitability, about how Walter's ritual proceeds regardless of your desires or actions. The boss fight in the water prison is against a massive monster that embodies the location's themes, a water-dwelling creature that drags itself along grates, confined but powerful, representing imprisonment and the violence it breeds. Defeating it requires pattern recognition and resource expenditure. The victory feels hollow because you haven't stopped Walter, haven't saved anyone, have merely survived one more test. Returning to room 302 after the water prison reveals increased haunting, more ghosts, more furniture displaced. The apartment is actively hostile now, making rest periods stressful rather than relaxing. You're managing haunting levels, using holy candles and saint medallions to suppress ghosts temporarily, arranging furniture to create safe paths, deciding which rooms to abandon to the haunting. The apartment is no longer a refuge, it's a second parallel threat, building world. The fourth world takes Henry to an apartment building similar to South Ashfield Heights, but distorted wrong. This is where Walter lived briefly after leaving Wish House, where he committed several sacraments, where his obsession with room 302 intensified. The building is a twisted mirror of Henry's reality. Familiar layout but nightmare logic. Apartments containing horrors instead of residents. The building world is the game's longest, most complex environment. Multiple floors, dozens of rooms, puzzles requiring items found floors apart, enemy encounters, and cramped hallways where avoidance is difficult. The game is testing your mastery of its systems: combat avoidance, resource management, spatial navigation, inventory puzzle solving. It's also the most frustrating world for many players because the building's size and similar looking corridors create disorientation. Here you encounter Eileen Galvin for the first time in the other world, Eileen is Henry's neighbor from room 303, a woman he's seen through his peephole but never spoken to directly. In the building world, she's injured, frightened, and becomes your companion. This is Silent Hill 4's major gameplay shift. You're no longer alone. Eileen follows you, requires protection, has her own health bar, and can be damaged by enemies. If she dies, the game's ending changes. If she's too damaged, the best endings become inaccessible. Escorting Eileen transforms the gameplay. You're not just surviving, you're protecting. Every enemy encounter becomes more complex because you must position yourself between threats and Eileen. She can fight, she has a taser type weapon, but she's not effective, and letting her take damage is failure even if she doesn't die. The game becomes escort mission, a genre many players dislike, but thematically it's perfect. Henry is ordinary, incompetent at violence, but he's trying to save someone. The effort matters more than the skill. The building world also contains more of Walter's history. You find apartments he broke into, shrines he created, evidence of his deteriorating mental state as the ritual consumed him. One apartment contains a diary detailing his thought process, how he selected victims, how he rationalized each murder as necessary for the greater purpose, how he believed he was showing them mercy by making them part of Paradise's creation. This is the diary of someone deeply mentally ill, conditioned by childhood trauma and cult indoctrination into believing murder was salvation. The climax of the building world involves confronting twin victim ghosts simultaneously while protecting Eileen. The game's weakest combat mechanics are most frustrating here. Tank controls and clumsy hit detection make fighting two aggressive ghosts while keeping a companion safe extraordinarily difficult. Many players consider this the game's lowest point mechanically, but the thematic purpose is clear. You're overwhelmed, outmatched, barely surviving through determination rather than skill. This is what horror should feel like. Not power fantasy, but desperate scrambling. Returning to room 302 with Eileen changes the apartment's dynamic. She's injured, resting in the bedroom, and her presence offers momentary comfort. You're not alone anymore. But her injury, marked by a ritual brand Walter inflicted, is spreading. The apartment's haunting affects her more severely. She's becoming a conduit for the curse, and the game's final hours will involve racing to complete the ritual interruption before Eileen is fully possessed or dies. Hospital World. The fifth major world revisits St. Jerome's Hospital, where Walter was taken after being found abandoned. The hospital is massive, labyrinthine, filled with examination rooms and operating theaters and morgues. This is medical horror, the fear of institutional care, of being reduced to a patient number, of procedures performed without consent. Walter experienced this as an infant, and his adult crimes circle back here for later sacraments. The hospital in Silent Hill 4 builds on the medical horror from previous games but emphasizes sterility rather than decay. The hallways are too clean, the lights too bright, the equipment too perfect. It's uncanny. This place should feel safe, but doesn't. The enemies here are twisted medical staff, creatures that wear nurse uniforms or wield surgical instruments. They're not sexy monster nurses like Silent Hill 2's bubblehead nurses. They're functionary, anonymous, representing institutional violence. You find more victims here, more evidence of Walter's crimes. The hospital served as a sacrament site multiple times. Patients selected because they fit ritual requirements, killed with medical precision. Walter wasn't frenzied, he was methodical, treating each murder as a surgical procedure necessary for rebirth. The hospital staff never suspected him because he moved through spaces like he belonged. Another authorized presence in a building full of authorized violence. Eileen's condition worsens in the hospital world. She's moving slower, taking more damage, occasionally stopping to clutch her wound. The game is creating urgency. You can't afford to spend excessive time here. Every moment delayed is another moment Eileen deteriorates. But the hospital requires thorough exploration, multiple backtracking sequences, complex puzzle solutions. The tension between careful exploration and narrative urgency is intentional, forcing you to make risk assessments about when to push forward versus when to be thorough. The hospital world also contains explicit Silent Hill 2 references. Documents mention James Sunderland and the Toluca Lake incident. You find evidence that Walter Sullivan's crimes were being investigated in connection with similar occurrences in Silent Hill itself. The games exist in the same continuity, and Walter's ritual, while centered on Room 302, draws power from Silent Hill's spiritual mechanics. The town's curse isn't limited to its geographic boundaries. It radiates outward, affecting Ashfield, touching anyone whose trauma aligns with its particular frequency. The hospital's final area is a surreal morgue where victim bodies are stored, each marked with the number of their sacrament. This is Walter's trophy room, his evidence that the ritual is progressing according to plan. Standing among these corpses, each representing a life ended to fuel one man's delusion, is profoundly disturbing. The game makes you witness the full scope of Walter's crimes, not abstract numbers, but individual people reduced to ritual components. Escaping the hospital requires solving a final puzzle involving medical records and patient histories. The solution reveals connections between victims. Some knew each other, some were related, some were selected because their deaths would ripple through specific social networks. Walter didn't just kill randomly. He chose victims whose deaths would maximize suffering and chaos, accelerating the world's descent toward the apocalyptic state where paradise could emerge. This is horror rooted in genuine cult logic, the belief that destruction precedes renewal, that chaos is the womb of new order. The second half, revisiting and revelation, after completing the initial 5 worlds, Silent Hill 4 forces you to revisit each location. This is the game's most controversial design decision. You're returning to areas you've already explored, but they've changed. New enemy placements, new puzzle elements, Eileen's presence altering navigation, and most significantly, you're playing through the back half of Walter's ritual. The worlds are no longer just memory. They're active ritual sites where Walter is completing the final sacraments. The revisits serve multiple purposes. Narratively, they show how Walter's ritual is accelerating, how the worlds are destabilizing as the 21st sacrament approaches. Mechanically, they test mastery of systems you've learned. You know these environments now, but the changes force adaptation. Thematically, they create cyclical dread. You're trapped in Walter's loop, watching him repeat his crimes with variations, unable to break free until you understand the ritual deeply enough to disrupt it. The subway revisit is darker, more hostile. Cynthia's ghost haunts the platforms. New enemies, stronger variants, patrol areas that were previously clear. You're protecting Eileen while solving revised puzzles and fighting through increased resistance. The game is more difficult here and not always in fair ways. Enemy damage is higher, resources are scarcer, and the escort mechanics strain against level design that wasn't fully optimized for companion AI. The forest revisit reveals more of Wish House's depths. You descend into basement levels that weren't accessible before, finding ritual chambers where the cult conducted ceremonies. The architecture is explicitly occult, pentagrams painted on floors, altars stained with old blood, implements of indoctrination and punishment. This is where Walter learned to be what he became. Walking through these spaces provides context but not comfort. Understanding doesn't excuse, and the weight of what was done to children here is crushing. The Water Prison Revisit introduces escort combat at its most challenging. The tight corridors, aggressive enemies, and Eileen's vulnerability create situations where perfect play is required to avoid significant damage. Many players struggled here, finding the difficulty spike punishing. But this frustration is partly intentional. You're meant to feel overwhelmed, meant to understand that Henry is in over his head, that survival is uncertain, and victory contingent on persistence rather than skill. The building revisit is where Silent Hill 4's mechanical issues are most apparent. The already complex environment becomes more hostile, with enemies positioned to block optimal paths and puzzles requiring extensive backtracking. Eileen takes consistent damage, and keeping her healthy for the best ending requires near perfect play. This is where many players gave up on achieving the ideal ending, accepting that Eileen would be heavily damaged and the game's conclusion would reflect that failure. The hospital revisit culminates in confronting Walter directly, not his ghost or his child form, but his adult manifestation, calm, assured, explaining his purpose without anger or madness. He's not a raving villain. He's someone who believes he's doing right, who sees his murders as acts of mercy, who genuinely thinks he's helping his victims achieve transcendence through incorporation into his ritual. This dialogue is chilling because Walter isn't wrong within his belief system. He's simply operating from premises that are fundamentally incompatible with ethical existence. The revisits also reveal Joseph Schreiber's full story. The previous tenant of room 302, Joseph investigated Walter's crimes, discovered the ritual structure, and attempted to disrupt it. He was partially successful. His interference delayed the final sacraments, gave Henry time to prepare, provided the tools necessary for resistance. But Joseph ultimately failed, became a victim himself, his spirit trapped in the apartment, warning Henry to avoid the same fate. His notes, discovered throughout the revisits, are desperate attempts to help future victims, to ensure his death wasn't meaningless. Joseph's character represents another of Silent Hill 4's themes, the cost of knowledge. He understood too much, looked too deeply into Walter's crimes, and was consumed by the very ritual he tried to stop. This is cosmic horror logic. There are things humanity shouldn't know, pursuits that damn the pursuer. Joseph learned how the 21 sacraments worked and became Sacrament 20, his investigation marking him as the perfect penultimate victim. His tragedy is that understanding didn't grant power, it merely ensured his destruction, the final confrontation breaking the cycle. After completing all revisits, Silent Hill 4 forces you toward its conclusion. Room 302 is almost entirely possessed. Ghosts in every room, the apartment actively trying to kill Henry, Eileen's condition critical. The only remaining option is to enter the final hole, confront Walter directly, and disrupt the ritual before the 21st sacrament is completed. The final world is room 302 itself, but not Henry's version. This is Walter's room 302, his childhood memory made manifest, the mother he's been trying to return to all along. The apartment is simultaneously familiar and wrong. Same layout, but details shift, walls breathe. The space feels organic rather than architectural. You're inside Walter's idealization of his birthplace, walking through his psychosis made physical, Walter is here in his adult form, calm and waiting. He's prepared for this confrontation because it's part of the ritual. The 21st sacrament must resist, must fight, must be overcome for the rebirth to be earned rather than given. If Henry simply surrendered, the ritual would fail. Walter needs opposition, needs to prove his worthiness through combat and persistence. This is why he's been guiding Henry all along, why the holes appeared, why Joseph's warnings were left. All of it serves the ritual's requirements. The game presents multiple possible endings depending on several factors: Eileen's health throughout the second half, the number of times you've entered your apartment's haunted rooms, specific actions taken during boss encounters, and whether you've collected all the ritual items. These endings range from hopeful escape to tragic death to ambiguous continuation. Silent Hill 4 refuses easy resolution, maintaining the series' tradition of multiple conclusions that each feel true in different ways. The best ending requires protecting Eileen meticulously, minimizing apartment haunting, and performing specific ritual interruptions. In this conclusion, Henry and Eileen escape room 302, destroy Walter's spirit, break the curse on the apartment, and begin rebuilding their lives. Eileen's survival matters emotionally. She represents Henry's ability to save someone despite his incompetence, to matter despite feeling powerless. Her living is proof that Henry's ordinary heroism succeeded where trained professionals failed. The worst ending sees Henry consumed by the apartment, Eileen dead or possessed, Walter's ritual complete. Room 302 becomes a permanent nexus of horror, claiming future tenants in endless cycles. This ending is punishment for player failure, but also acknowledgement that sometimes horror wins, that not all curses can be broken, that Walter's conditioning and trauma created machinery that can't simply be dismantled through individual effort. The middle endings offer variations. Eileen survives but damaged, Henry escapes but haunted, Walter defeated but the apartment still cursed. These feel most realistic, acknowledging that trauma's effects persist, that victory over supernatural evil doesn't erase the mundane damage done to survivors. Silent Hill has always understood this. Its best endings are bittersweet, marked by loss even in triumph. The final boss fight against Walter is mechanically simple but thematically rich. You're fighting an already dead man, a ghost sustained by ritual power and childhood programming. Damaging him physically is futile. He'll regenerate unless you disrupt the ritual holding him together. This requires using the ceremonial items you've collected: swords that can pin his umbilical cord, a grotesque physical manifestation connecting Walter to the mother room, breaking his connection to the apartment womb he's trying to enter. This final sequence is the game's thesis made interactive. You can't defeat Walter through violence alone. You must understand his psychology, his ritual, his beliefs, and disrupt them at their conceptual level. The swords pinning the umbilical cord literalize severing unhealthy attachment, cutting the connection between trauma and identity, forcing Walter to exist separate from the mother he's built his entire being around. It's psychological horror rendered as gameplay mechanic. When Walter is finally defeated, really defeated, his ritual broken irreparably, he doesn't rage or curse. He seems confused, lost, like a child who's been told the story he's believed all his life is false. His final words are a question. Mother? He's calling for the apartment, for the only parent he ever knew, and receiving no answer. It's a devastating moment, rendering the villain pathetic at the exact instant of his defeat. You've won, but the victory feels like participating in tragedy rather than preventing it. Themes and symbolism, isolation, obsession, and false births. Silent Hill 4 operates on multiple thematic levels simultaneously. On the surface, it's a game about being trapped in your apartment. One level deeper, it's about serial murder and ritual sacrifice. Deeper still, it's about childhood trauma, cult indoctrination, and the search for maternal connection. At its deepest, it's about how spaces can become psychologically charged, how isolation breeds obsession, and how trauma perpetuates through symbolic repetition. The apartment as prison is the most obvious theme. Room 302 should represent safety, home, privacy, control over your environment. The game inverts this. Your apartment becomes the most dangerous space, the place you can't escape, the location where you're most vulnerable. This mirrors real psychological experiences of agoraphobia, where home becomes prison because leaving feels impossible, or domestic abuse, where the place that should be safe is actually the site of greatest threat. Team Silent was drawing from real horror, cinema, and literature. Polanski's Repulsion shows a woman's apartment becoming hallucinatory as her mental state deteriorates. Sartre's No Exit famously established hell as other people in a locked room. Poe's The Mask of the Red Death traps aristocrats in their castle while death stalks them. Silent Hill 4 takes these influences and makes them interactive. You're not watching someone trapped, you're experiencing the trap, feeling the walls close in, understanding viscerally why isolation breeds horror. Walter's obsession with Room 302 represents the danger of attachment to trauma sites. The apartment is literally where he was abandoned, yet he identifies it as mother, the only source of love available. This is tragically common in abuse survivors. The place where harm occurred becomes the place they feel they belong because it's what they know. Walter's inability to conceive of love outside Room 302 reflects genuine psychological damage. The way trauma narrows worldview until nothing exists beyond the pain and the site where pain occurred. The 21 sacrament structure represents ritualized compulsion, the need to repeat, to follow patterns, to believe that if you just complete the sequence perfectly, everything will be right. This mirrors OCD, where ritual behaviors feel necessary for safety or addiction, where the cycle of seeking, using, and regretting repeats endlessly. Walter can't stop because stopping means admitting his entire life has been wasted, that the people he killed died for nothing, that his mother is just an apartment and his purpose was delusion. The game's use of umbilical imagery is consistently disturbing and psychologically precise. Walter's connection to Room 302 is visualized as an umbilical cord, gross, biological, impossible to ignore. The cord represents unhealthy attachment, the psychological link between trauma and identity that must be severed for healing. When you're fighting Walter's final form, you're literally cutting this cord, performing a forced birth in reverse, separating him from the mother he's been trying to return to all along. The false mother concept is central. Room 302 cannot actually be a parent. Its architecture, it's not alive. It has no capacity for love. But to Walter, conditioned from infancy by the cult, the distinction doesn't matter. He's imprinted on the space like a baby duck on the first moving thing it sees. The tragedy is that Room 302 can't reciprocate, can't actually provide the maternal connection Walter craves, meaning his entire existence is oriented toward an impossibility. He's trying to be born from something that can't give birth, to be held by something that can't hold. The game's treatment of Eileen adds another layer. She's a normal person, living her normal life, who becomes caught in Walter's ritual through proximity. She's victimized not because of anything she did, but because she lives next door to a cursed apartment. This randomness is horror. You can do everything right and still be consumed by forces beyond your understanding or control. Eileen represents collateral damage, the way trauma radiates outward, affecting innocence. Henry and Eileen's relationship, developing across the game's second half, offers redemptive possibility. They're both ordinary people facing extraordinary horror. Neither is trained or prepared, but they help each other, share resources, communicate. Their cooperation is the game's counter to Walter's isolation. Where Walter's worldview is solipsistic, only he and his mother matter. Henry and Eileen demonstrate that connection, even forged in crisis, can provide the strength to resist ritual compulsion. The game's multiple endings reflect different relationships to trauma. In endings where Eileen survives healthy, trauma is overcome through care and protection. In endings where Eileen dies, trauma wins, consuming everything. In endings where Eileen survives damaged, trauma persists but doesn't completely destroy. Scars remain, but life continues. This range acknowledges that trauma's outcomes aren't binary, that survival isn't always victory, that damage can be permanent while still allowing for meaningful existence afterward. The ghost mechanics, where victims return to haunt room 302, represent the persistence of the past. Walter's victims don't rest peacefully. They're trapped in the same cycle as him, forced to repeat their deaths endlessly. This is trauma logic. The past doesn't stay past. It intrudes on the present, recurring until addressed. The only way to suppress ghosts temporarily is through ritual items, holy candles, saint medallions, acknowledging that managing trauma requires active effort and specific tools. The game's claustrophobia, limited spaces, recurring environments, the constant return to room 302 creates a sense of being trapped in a loop. This is how trauma survivors often describe their experience, going in circles, unable to escape patterns, feeling like they're always returning to the same painful place regardless of what they do. Silent Hill 4's structure literalizes this, making the gameplay loop reflect the psychological loop Walter's victims, including Henry, are caught in. Gameplay mechanics, innovation, and frustration. Silent Hill 4's gameplay departed significantly from series norms, introducing new mechanics that were ambitious but unevenly executed. The result was a game that felt fresh and experimental, but also clunky and frustrating, dividing players between those who appreciated the innovation and those who preferred the more polished mechanics of previous entries. The first-person perspective in Room 302 was Silent Hill 4's most striking change. Previous games used third-person cameras exclusively. In the apartment, you see through Henry's eyes, examining objects directly, looking through the peephole at neighbors passing by, experiencing the space intimately. This perspective shift makes the apartment feel personal, like your actual living space, which makes its corruption more viscerally disturbing. The first-person exploration also allows for environmental storytelling that third person wouldn't permit. You're close enough to see small details, scratches on walls, blood drops on floor tiles, the texture of the chains on your door. The game uses this proximity to create unease through subtle changes. Items move between visits. New messages appear. The apartment breathes and shifts in ways you notice because you're experiencing it at human scale rather than camera distance. But the first-person perspective only applies in the apartment. Other worlds use third person, creating a jarring transition when you crawl through holes. This inconsistency bothered some players, feeling like the game couldn't commit to either perspective. But thematically, the shift makes sense. The apartment is Henry's POV, his subjective experience. The other worlds are external nightmares where you're watching Henry navigate rather than being Henry. The perspective change marks the boundary between personal space and hostile territory. The inventory system was overhauled. Instead of a limited inventory requiring storage box management like previous games, Silent Hill 4 introduced an item storage chest in room 302. You could carry a few items into other worlds, but the bulk of your inventory stayed in the apartment. This meant frequent returns to drop off keys, puzzle items, or excess weapons, then retrieving different items for new areas. Some players found this tedious, others appreciated how it forced engagement with the apartment and made inventory decisions meaningful. The escort mechanics with Eileen were Silent Hill 4's most controversial addition. From the building world onward, Eileen accompanies Henry, creating companion AI challenges the series hadn't faced before. She has her own health bar, can be damaged by enemies, and will attack with a stun weapon when threatened. Her AI is functional but flawed. She sometimes gets caught on geometry, occasionally stands in harmful areas, and can't be directly controlled beyond basic follow, Fashion, wait commands. Protecting Eileen adds tension. Every combat encounter becomes a puzzle. How do you position yourself to absorb damage meant for her? How do you defeat enemies quickly enough that they don't overwhelm her? The game's clunky combat mechanics, already challenging when you're only protecting yourself, become genuinely difficult when you're also protecting a vulnerable AI companion. This difficulty is intentional. Henry is incompetent at violence, and adding a second person to protect makes situations barely manageable. But the execution wasn't perfect. Eileen's damage directly affects the ending you receive, meaning players aiming for the best ending had to play perfectly for hours. Any mistake, any enemy attack that connected with Eileen rather than Henry, brought you closer to a worse ending. The high-stakes escort challenge frustrated players who wanted to experience the story without mechanical punishment for imperfect play. The combat itself was the series' most problematic. Previous Silent Hill games had clunky combat, but it was serviceable. Silent Hill 4's combat felt unresponsive. Hit detection was inconsistent. Weapon swings had long recovery animations. Enemies could hit you during your recovery frames. The charge attack system let you hold R2 to power up weapon swings, but charging left you vulnerable, and the benefit rarely seemed worth the risk. Enemy design contributed to combat frustration. Some monsters were fast and unpredictable, others tanky and aggressive. The ghosts, immune to permanent damage, forced you into repeated combat or risky avoidance. The game wanted you to avoid fighting, but level design often required engaging enemies in confined spaces where avoidance was impossible. This created situations where you were forced into the game's weakest mechanic. The resource management, a survival horror staple, was present but less refined than in earlier entries. Health items were relatively abundant, ammunition sufficient for players who were conservative. The difficulty came less from scarcity and more from the damage you take due to poor combat mechanics. You might have plenty of healing items but need them constantly because the combat system made avoiding damage difficult. The puzzle design varied wildly in quality. Some puzzles were clever environmental challenges requiring careful observation and logical deduction. Others were obtuse, requiring trial and error or consulting guides because the solutions weren't reasonably deducible from available information. The subway world's early puzzles were straightforward. The building world's later puzzles were frustrating, requiring keys hidden in easily missed locations, or solutions based on cryptic hints scattered across multiple floors. The game's pacing suffered from backtracking. You'd complete an area, return to the apartment, then need to go back to the same area because a new path opened or a previously locked door was now accessible. This was standard for the series, but Silent Hill 4's larger environments made backtracking feel like padding rather than exploration. The apartment as hub meant you were constantly walking the same hallways, interacting with the same storage chest, seeing the same haunted rooms. The ghost enemies represented an interesting but poorly implemented mechanic. You couldn't kill them permanently. They'd be knocked down by sword attacks but would rise again after a few seconds. The only way to suppress them temporarily was using limited holy candles, which required standing still and lighting them, leaving you vulnerable, or pinning them with special swords found in specific locations. This created tense encounters where you had to decide whether to fight through, use valuable resources, or accept damage to run past, but the ghost encounters became repetitive. The same ghosts appeared in the same locations repeatedly. Their behavior was predictable. After the initial shock of encountering unkillable enemies, they became tedious obstacles rather than genuine threats. The game needed either fewer ghost encounters or more varied ghost behaviors to maintain tension across a 15-hour playthrough. The hauntings in Room 302 were mechanically innovative but divisive. As the game progressed, ghosts would spawn in the apartment, draining Henry's health through proximity. You could manage this through careful room navigation, using ritual items to suppress hauntings, or simply accepting minor health loss. The apartment's transformation from safe haven to active threat was thematically perfect, but mechanically it meant your save point hub became stressful rather than relaxing. The multiple ending system, while standard for Silent Hill, was implemented in a way that frustrated many players. The factors determining endings were opaque. You needed to protect Eileen consistently, minimize apartment hauntings, and perform specific actions during boss fights, but the game never explicitly told you this. Players could finish the game having played carefully, but still receive a bad ending because they didn't know which factors mattered. This led to guide consultation, which undermined the organic experience of discovering consequences naturally. Despite these mechanical issues, Silent Hill 4 did innovate successfully in several areas. The apartment as evolving hub was conceptually brilliant. The first-person perspective and personal space created intimacy. The connection between player actions across multiple hours and the ending received felt consequential. The game was ambitious, trying things no previous Silent Hill had attempted, and while not all innovation succeeded, the willingness to experiment was admirable. Visual design and atmosphere, Masahiro Ito's Nightmare World. Masahiro Ito returned as creature designer for Silent Hill 4, continuing his role as the visual architect of the series' monsters. His approach to Silent Hill 4's enemies was to create beings that reflected Walter Sullivan's psyche and the ritual's themes: birth, childhood trauma, institutional violence, and obsessive attachment. The result was a bestiary that was disturbing and symbolically rich, even when the gameplay surrounding these creatures was frustrating. The tremor is one of the first enemies you encounter, a human figure with its head trapped inside what looks like a fleshy womb or cocoon. The creature's arms flail as it stumbles toward you, blind and helpless yet hostile. The design is explicitly birth trauma related. This is a person stuck in the birth process, unable to fully emerge, attacking out of panic rather than malice. In Walter's ritual, birth is corrupted, making the tremor a perfect symbol for his twisted understanding of maternal connection. The twin victim appears as a pair of children merged at the torso, wielding what might be oversized heads or malformed limbs as weapons. They represent Walter Sacrament's number 3 and 4, twins whose deaths were required by the ritual. Ito's design makes them sympathetic and terrifying simultaneously. They're clearly children, but their fusion and aggression make them dangerous. Fighting them feels wrong, which is intentional. Walter's ritual demands child murders, and these manifestations force you to experience the horror of that requirement. The Wall Man is one of Silent Hill 4's most unsettling creations. It's a human figure with arms and legs splayed wide, face obscured or absent, emerging from walls as if it's part of the architecture. The Wall Man represents people trapped in structures, absorbed into buildings, losing individual identity to institutional systems. When Walter was trapped in prison and hospitals, he may have felt like this, just another body in the system, no longer a person but a piece of the facility's machinery. The ghosts, victim spirits that haunt both Otherworlds and Room 302 are rendered as pale, floating figures, often maintaining recognizable human features but marked by the violence of their deaths. Cynthia Velasquez's ghost looks like Cynthia, but drained of color, moving with jerky unreality. These ghosts represent the persistence of trauma, the way victims remain present long after death, haunting the spaces where they were harmed. Their invincibility reflects how the past can't be killed, only managed. The patients are hospital-based enemies, figures in wheelchairs or on gurneys that attack with disturbing speed. They represent medical trauma, the fear of being immobilized and helpless while institutional caregivers have complete control over your body. Walter experienced this as a child, found injured, taken to hospitals, subjected to examinations and treatments he didn't understand or consent to. The patients literalized that powerlessness made aggressive. The greedy worms are grotesque, massive, slug-like creatures with human faces or features, suggesting people reduced to base instincts, consumed by desire or need. They appear in the later worlds, representing the degeneration Walter's ritual causes. As the sacraments progress and reality warps, victims don't just die, they're transformed into these lesser beings, their humanity stripped away by the ritual's dehumanizing logic. The sound design under Akira Yamaoka's continued direction maintained the series' high standard while adapting to Silent Hill 4's unique atmosphere. The apartment sequences used minimal music, relying on ambient noise, the hum of the refrigerator, water dripping in the bathroom, the creak of floorboards. This quietness made every sudden sound, the appearance of a ghost, the static from your radio, a knock at the door you can't answer, viscerally shocking. The Otherworld sections featured Yamaoka's signature industrial soundscapes, metallic clangs, machinery grinding, distant screams that might be wind through broken infrastructure. Room of Angel, the game's most memorable track, plays during significant emotional moments, a haunting melody with processed vocals, creating the feeling of someone trying to communicate across an impossible distance. The song represents Eileen, or perhaps represents Henry's determination to save her, or perhaps represents Walter's relationship with his mother, depending on interpretation. The environmental design varied by world. The subway world used institutional horror, harsh, fluorescent lighting, concrete platforms, rusted trains. Every surface was hard, cold, hostile to human comfort. The forest world contrasted with organic decay, trees growing wrong, structures consumed by rot, nature twisted into unnatural forms. The water prison was claustrophobic metal and darkness, playing on drowning fears and confinement anxiety. The building world reused assets from previous segments, which some players criticized as lazy design but could also be interpreted as intentional. This is a mirror world, a familiar structure made wrong through repetition and variation. You recognize the layouts because they're based on Room 302's building, but everything is slightly off, creating the uncanny valley effect where familiarity breeds unease rather than comfort. The hospital world was sterile white, almost too clean, suggesting institutional violence hiding beneath medical professionalism. The bright lights cast harsh shadows. The examination rooms were too perfect, suggesting they've never actually been used for care. This is healthcare as horror, the institutional system that should protect instead threatens, where bodies become objects to be processed rather than people to be healed. Room 302 itself was the game's most important visual space. The developers created a fully realized apartment with attention to mundane detail. The kitchen had appliances and dishes. The bathroom had toiletries. The bedroom had personal items suggesting Henry's life before the nightmare. This realism made the apartment's corruption more effective. When blood starts seeping from walls or chains manifest where none existed, the contrast between normal and nightmare is stark. The first person perspective in the apartment allowed for visual storytelling through Henry's gaze. Looking through the peephole lets you watch Eileen across the hall, observe the landlord passing by, see the maintenance man's routine. You're spying on ordinary life you can't access, separated by impossible chains from the normalcy right outside your door. This visual reminder of proximity to escape makes the imprisonment more psychologically crushing. The lighting in room 302 changes as the game progresses. Initially warm and cozy, the apartment gradually becomes darker, colder, less welcoming. By the game's end, the lighting is harsh and angular, casting deep shadows, making familiar spaces feel hostile. This visual progression mirrors the haunting's intensification. The apartment isn't just spiritually corrupted, but visually transformed, its very appearance rejecting Henry's presence. Reception and Legacy, the troubled fourth entry Silent Hill 4. The room released to mixed critical reception and divided fan response. Professional reviewers generally scored it in the 7-10 range. Not bad, but significantly lower than Silent Hill 2's near universal acclaim or Silent Hill 3's strong reception. The game was recognized for its ambition and atmosphere, but criticized for its mechanical issues, particularly the combat, the escort sections, and the repetitive second half structure. GameSpot's review noted the game's disturbing atmosphere and interesting premise, but criticized the clunky combat and frustrating enemy design. IGN's review praised the return to psychological horror after Silent Hill 3's more action-oriented approach, but found fault with the backtracking and the escort mechanics. Eurogamer appreciated the game's willingness to experiment but questioned whether all experiments succeeded, particularly highlighting the ghost encounters as repetitive and tedious. Fan response was even more divided. Silent Hill 2 had created expectations about what the series could be, psychological horror at its finest, with complex characters, sophisticated themes, and mechanics that served the atmosphere. Silent Hill 4 was different enough that it felt to some fans like a betrayal of the series' formula, while others appreciated that it tried something new rather than simply repeating what worked before. The game's commercial performance was solid but not exceptional. It sold roughly 1 million copies worldwide, respectable for a horror game in 2004, but below expectations set by previous entries. The multi-platform release helped. Previous Silent Hill games were PlayStation exclusives, but Silent Hill 4 on Xbox and PC reached audiences who couldn't play earlier entries. However, this broader release didn't translate to significantly higher sales, suggesting the game's mixed reputation affected its commercial success. Silent Hill 4's legacy is complicated. It was Team Silent's final complete game. After this, the team would be dissolved, with members scattered to other Konami projects or leaving the company entirely. Attempts to make a Silent Hill 5 within Team Silent failed, and the franchise would be handed to Western developers for future entries. This makes Silent Hill 4 both an ending and a missed opportunity, the last time the original creative vision would be fully realized, but also a game that didn't achieve its full potential. The game influenced later horror titles in specific ways. The apartment as hub concept, where your safe space gradually becomes hostile, was adopted by games like Resident Evil 7's Baker House or Visage's House of Horrors. The escort mechanics, while controversial in Silent Hill 4, were refined in games like The Last of Us, which improved companion AI and made protection feel less frustrating. The ritual murder structure influenced games like Condemned and its sequel, which explored serial killer psychology through gameplay. Within the Silent Hill franchise, Silent Hill 4 remained an outlier. Silent Hill Origins 2007 and Silent Hill Homecoming 2008, the first Western developed entries, largely ignored Silent Hill 4's innovations, returning to the series' earlier formula of exploring a fog-covered town. Silent Hill Shattered Memories 2009 did experiment with unconventional structure, suggesting Silent Hill 4's willingness to take risks had some lasting impact on the franchise's direction. The game's connection to Silent Hill 2 became a point of ongoing discussion. Walter Sullivan was mentioned in SH2's newspapers, creating continuity, but Silent Hill 4's story was largely self-contained, taking place primarily in Ashfield rather than Silent Hill proper. This geographic and narrative distance made some fans question whether Silent Hill 4 was truly a Silent Hill game or just a horror game wearing the franchise name. The developer's acknowledgement that the project began as a standalone title before being retrofitted into the series gave these concerns validity. Modding communities have kept Silent Hill 4 alive on PC, with fan patches improving stability, resolution support, and even attempting to fix some gameplay issues like enemy aggression and Eileen's AI. These community efforts demonstrate ongoing affection for the game despite its flaws. Players who love Silent Hill 4's ambition and atmosphere have worked to make it more accessible to new audiences, suggesting the game has passionate defenders, even if it never achieved universal acclaim. The game's themes resonated with players who'd experienced trauma, isolation, or the slow corruption of safe spaces. Forum discussions and analysis videos explored how Silent Hill 4 captured the feeling of being trapped in your own life, unable to escape patterns even when you understand they're harmful. This emotional authenticity, even when the gameplay was frustrating, created a lasting connection for some players that transcended mechanical issues. Silent Hill 4's most lasting contribution may be its demonstration that horror games could experiment with unconventional structures. Not every innovation succeeded, but the willingness to try, to make the protagonist's home the most dangerous space, to structure a game around repeated visits to changing environments, to build horror from isolation rather than constant monster encounters, showed that the genre had room for approaches beyond what Resident Evil had established. This experimental spirit, even in failure, was valuable. The unanswered questions Walter's religion and the cult's reach Silent Hill 4 raised as many questions as it answered about the order, the cult that permeated the series' mythology. Walter Sullivan's conditioning at Wish House Orphanage was explored, but the specifics of the cult's theology regarding the 21 sacraments remained ambiguous. Was this ritual drawn from established order doctrine, or did Walter synthesize it from fragments of teaching combined with his own delusions? The game never explicitly confirms which, leaving Walter's relationship to the cult's mainstream beliefs uncertain. The Order, as established in previous games, worshipped a god they sought to birth through suffering. Alessa Gillespie in Silent Hill 1, Heather Mason in Silent Hill 3. Both were vessels meant to carry divinity. Walter's ritual seems related but distinct. He wasn't trying to birth a god in another person. He was trying to birth himself into room 302, to be born from his mother into some transformed state. This suggests either a splinter interpretation of the cult's theology, or that Walter fundamentally misunderstood what he'd been taught. The game provides documents from Wish House showing the cult's teachings, but they're deliberately vague. Children were taught that paradise required sacrifice, that suffering purified, that the world must be destroyed before it could be remade. These are consistent with the Order's philosophy from previous games, but the specific ritual of 21 murders arranged in sacramental order isn't mentioned in any document from previous games, or even in most documents within Silent Hill 4 itself. This suggests Walter may have created his own interpretation, constructing the 21 sacraments from pieces of cult doctrine combined with his personal obsessions. The significance of the number 21 is never fully explained. The game hints at tarot symbolism, 21 cards in the major arcana plus the Fool. In numerology, 21 reduces to 3, 2 plus 1, representing completion, trinity, synthesis. But why specifically 21 rather than some other symbolically significant number? The Order in previous games used various numbers. The seal of Metatron has specific geometric properties. The halo of the sun uses circular divisions. Walter's choice of 21 might be personal rather than doctrinally mandated. Each sacrament has a name: temptation, void, source, watchfulness, justice, etc. These names suggest philosophical or spiritual concepts, but their meanings in Walter's cosmology are never fully explicated. Temptation for Cynthia makes sense. She was described as flirtatious, representing worldly desire Walter needed to overcome, but other names are more cryptic. Source for Bobby, watchfulness for the twins. These could mean many things, and the game trusts players to interpret rather than explaining directly. The victims themselves seem chosen for symbolic rather than practical reasons. Walter didn't just kill randomly. He selected specific individuals who fit the ritual requirements. But how did he identify them? Did the cult teach him recognition methods? Did he have psychic sensitivity that let him perceive who would fulfill which sacrament? Or did he rationalize choices after the fact, finding symbolic significance in whoever he happened to target? The game suggests but never confirms the answer. Joseph Schreiber's investigation uncovered much of this, documenting Walter's pattern and attempting to disrupt the ritual. But Joseph's notes are fragmentary, written in desperation, as he realized he was being targeted. He understood the 21 sacrament structure, but not necessarily the theology behind it. His research provides information without interpretation, leaving players to assemble meaning from scattered evidence. The connection between Room 302 and the cult is also ambiguous. Was the apartment always significant to the Order, or did it become significant only because Walter imprinted on it? The game suggests the apartment building's proximity to Wish House wasn't coincidental, that the Order may have had some historical connection to South Ashfield Heights, but this is never confirmed. It's equally possible that Walter's obsession elevated an ordinary apartment to ritual significance through sheer force of traumatized belief. The ritual's ultimate purpose remains unclear. Walter believed completing the 21 sacraments would allow him to be born from room 302, but into what state? Would he become a god, a demon, a purified child, something else entirely? The cult promised paradise through their rituals, but what Walter imagined as paradise may have been entirely different from what the cult actually offered. He might have been working towards something the Order never intended. The game's ending, where Walter is defeated and the ritual broken, doesn't answer what would have happened had he succeeded. In the worst endings where Henry dies and the ritual presumably completes, we see room 302 become a permanent nexus of horror, but Walter doesn't emerge reborn. Either the ritual was flawed from the start, or Henry's resistance introduced corruption that prevented success even when all 21 deaths occurred. The game leaves this ambiguous, suggesting that perhaps the ritual was always impossible, Walter's entire life devoted to achieving something the universe wouldn't permit. This ambiguity is classic Silent Hill. The series has always refused to explain its mythology completely, leaving gaps for interpretation and speculation. But Silent Hill 4's ambiguities feel more frustrating than previous games' mysteries because Walter's ritual is so specific, so carefully structured, that you expect more concrete answers about its origins and purposes. The game gives you the what and the how, but remains deliberately vague about the why, trusting that the horror is more effective when you're uncertain whether Walter was following genuine occult principles or just enacting an elaborate delusion. The technical aspects, engine, performance, and multi-platform challenges Silent Hill 4 was built on an evolved version of the engine used for Silent Hill 3, but the multi-platform development introduced complications that affected the final product. Previous Silent Hill games were PlayStation 2 exclusives, allowing Team Silent to optimize for a single hardware configuration. Silent Hill 4's release on PS2, Xbox, and PC meant designing for different architectures simultaneously, creating compromises that impacted visuals, performance, and implementation of certain mechanics. The PlayStation 2 version was the lead platform and generally ran adequately, maintaining frame rates in most areas but experiencing drops during intense combat or when multiple ghosts spawned in room 302. The PS2's limitations in rendering transparency effects were evident in the fog, which looked less dense than in previous entries. The hardware struggled with the more complex lighting in certain otherworld segments, resulting in simplified shadows and occasional pop-in when transitioning between areas. The Xbox version offered better performance in some areas, more stable frame rates, slightly improved texture filtering, and better draw distances in larger environments. The Xbox's additional memory allowed for smoother loading between sections of interconnected worlds. However, the port wasn't perfect. Some audio mixing was different, certain atmospheric effects were subtly altered, and the controller layout required adjustment that some players found less intuitive than the PS2's configuration. The PC version was simultaneously the best and worst version. On capable hardware, it ran at higher resolutions and frame rates than console versions, with improved texture detail and lighting effects. The mouse and keyboard controls offered precision aiming that made combat somewhat less frustrating. However, the port suffered from technical issues, bugs causing crashes, save corruption problems, compatibility issues with certain graphics cards, and inconsistent performance across different configurations. These problems weren't universal. Some players had flawless experiences, but enough users encountered issues that the PC version gained a reputation for instability. The game's audio implementation varied across platforms. The PlayStation 2 version used compressed audio that occasionally resulted in quality loss during intense sequences. The Xbox version's better audio hardware produced clearer sound, particularly in Yamaoka's industrial tracks, where layered noise elements benefited from improved fidelity. The PC version's audio depended heavily on the user's sound card, ranging from excellent to problematic depending on hardware and driver compatibility. Loading times differed significantly. The PlayStation 2 version had noticeable loads when transitioning between worlds or entering new major areas within worlds. The Xbox faster DVD drive reduced these waits somewhat. The PC version, particularly when installed on faster hard drives, had the quickest loading, but could still experience stuttering during certain transitions as assets streamed in. The multi-platform development also affected design decisions. Certain mechanics that might have worked well on PlayStation 2 had to be adapted for Xbox's different controller layout. The PC version's mouse and keyboard controls fundamentally changed how players interacted with first-person apartment sequences and third-person combat. Team Silent had to design for the lowest common denominator in some cases, meaning PS2's limitations constrained what could be attempted across all platforms. The game's graphics, while impressive for 2004, showed signs of the engine straining against ambitious goals. The character models were detailed, particularly for Henry, Eileen, and Walter, with facial expressions that conveyed emotion effectively. The environments varied in quality. Some areas, like the hospital world, looked sharp and detailed, while others, like the building world, showed repetitive textures and simplified geometry that suggested rushed development or resource constraints. The lighting system was sophisticated for its time, using dynamic shadows and colored lights to create atmosphere. Room 302's lighting changed as the game progressed, requiring the engine to support multiple lighting states for the same geometry. The other worlds used aggressive lighting, harsh reds, sickly greens, stark whites that effectively communicated otherworldliness but sometimes resulted in areas where visibility became a problem rather than a feature. The enemy AI was inconsistent, partly due to engine limitations and partly due to design choices. Some enemies, like the Tremors and Patience, followed predictable patterns that players could learn. Others, like certain ghost types, used more complex pathing that occasionally broke. Ghosts getting stuck on geometry, enemies failing to pathfind around obstacles, companions like Eileen having trouble navigating tight spaces. These AI issues frustrated players who wanted reliable mechanical systems but appreciated realism. Frightened people don't navigate perfectly either. The camera system and third-person segments attempted to balance cinematic framing with player control. Fixed camera angles appeared in specific dramatic moments or confined spaces, creating classic survival horror compositions. But the game primarily used a follow camera that tracked behind Henry, offering better orientation but less atmospheric framing. The compromise satisfied neither camp. Players who wanted full camera control found it limiting, while those who preferred fixed cameras missed the carefully composed shots that defined earlier entries. The physics system was rudimentary by modern standards but functional. Objects could be knocked over, doors swung realistically, and character animation showed weight and momentum. But interactions were limited. You couldn't manipulate most objects, couldn't use environment as weapons or barriers, and physics-based puzzles were minimal. The engine supported what was necessary but didn't enable emergent gameplay that more sophisticated physics might have allowed. Performance optimization varied by area. The subway world ran relatively smoothly, limited geometry, constrained spaces, controlled lighting. The forest world, with organic shapes and outdoor environments, sometimes struggled to maintain frame rate. The building world's multiple floors and interconnected corridors pushed memory limits, resulting in longer loading when transitioning between floors. The hospital world's bright lighting and complex geometry created the most performance issues, particularly in the PC version where certain graphics settings could cause significant slowdown. The game's technical issues were never severe enough to make it unplayable, but were frustrating enough to affect the experience. Modern players attempting to run Silent Hill 4 on contemporary systems face even more challenges. Compatibility issues with Windows 10-11, resolution problems, audio glitches that didn't exist on original hardware. Community patches and fixes help, but the game's technical legacy is one of ambitious design, hampered by multi-platform compromises and an engine pushed slightly beyond its comfortable limits. Conclusion: The Room's place in Silent Hill history, Silent Hill 4. The Room stands as Team Silent's final statement, a game that was simultaneously too ambitious and not polished enough, too experimental and not refined enough, too different from what came before and not confident enough in its innovations. It's a game that frustrates and fascinates in equal measure, a project that reached for something unconventional and achieved it imperfectly, leaving behind a legacy that's respected more than loved. The game's greatest success was its premise. The idea of being trapped in your own apartment watching your sanctuary become hostile is conceptually brilliant psychological horror. The execution had problems. The gameplay loop became repetitive. The combat was frustrating. The escort sections tried patience. But the core concept was sound and original enough that even imperfect execution created memorable experiences. Players who finish Silent Hill 4 remember Room 302, remember the feeling of dread when returning home to find new ghosts, remember the oppressive claustrophobia of being sealed in familiar space. Walter Sullivan, as an antagonist, succeeded by being sympathetic without being forgiven. His backstory was tragic. His conditioning was abuse. His crimes were monstrous. The game asked you to understand him without excusing him, to see how trauma and cult indoctrination created a killer without absolving the killer of responsibility for his murders. This moral complexity was signature Team Silent, refusing simple answers about evil's origins or trauma's effects, acknowledging that understanding doesn't equal forgiveness and sympathy doesn't equal absolution. The game's failure was in its mechanics. The combat was the series' weakest. The escort sections were poorly balanced. The ghost encounters became tedious. The second half repetition felt like padding. These weren't insurmountable problems. Better playtesting and refinement could have addressed many issues, but either time constraints, resource limitations, or team inexperience prevented the polish that would have elevated the game from interesting failure to qualified success. Silent Hill 4's place in the franchise is as the dividing line. After this, Team Silent dissolved. Future games would be developed by Western studios working with different priorities and philosophies. Silent Hill Origins was action-focused combat. Homecoming emphasized mythology over psychology. Downpour tried open-world elements. These later games had merits, but they weren't Silent Hill in the way the first four games were, because they didn't come from the same creative vision or share the same sensibilities about what horror means and how games can express it. This makes Silent Hill 4 important beyond its individual quality. It's the last time the original vision was fully realized, the last time the creative team that understood the series' DNA controlled its direction. Subsequent games might have been technically superior, more polished, more commercially successful, but they were executing others' vision rather than expressing their own. Silent Hill 4 is flawed Team Silent rather than polished corporate product, and in horror, a genre where vision matters more than execution, there's value in that authenticity. The game's influence on horror gaming was modest but real. The apartment as hub concept inspired later games. The ritual murder structure influenced psychological horror narratives. The willingness to experiment with unconventional mechanics demonstrated that survival horror could evolve beyond the formula Resident Evil established. Not every game that learned from Silent Hill 4 acknowledged the debt, but you can trace lines of influence from Room 302 to games that came after. For players who experienced Silent Hill 4 on release, it was a divisive experience that either delivered exactly what they wanted, experimental horror from trusted creators, or disappointed expectations set by Silent Hill 2's masterpiece, Status, for players discovering it later, freed from the context of release anticipation. The game can be evaluated on its own merits rather than against predecessor expectations. Modern players often appreciate its ambition more than contemporary audiences did, viewing its failures as interesting missteps rather than franchise betrayals. The game's themes, isolation, obsession, trauma, the corruption of safe spaces, remain relevant. The feeling of being trapped in your own life, unable to escape patterns even when you understand they're harmful, resonates across time and culture. Walter's tragedy of being shaped by abuse into becoming an abuser himself speaks to cycles of trauma that repeat across generations. Room 302's transformation from sanctuary to prison mirrors how depression and anxiety can poison familiar spaces until nowhere feels safe. 20 years after release, Silent Hill 4, The Room stands as a complicated legacy piece. It's not the best Silent Hill game. That's debatable between 1 and 2. It's not the worst. The later Western entries claimed that distinction for many fans. It's the strangest, the most experimental, the most willing to break series conventions even at the cost of alienating players who wanted more of what worked before. And it's the last time the original creative team got to make a Silent Hill game on their terms, which makes it valuable regardless of execution quality. The Room still waits. Room 302, South Ashfield Heights. In the game's fiction, it was cleansed, the curse broken, Walter's spirit defeated. But thematically, symbolically, the room persists. It's the space where horror lives, where trauma echoes, where ordinary architecture becomes supernatural prison. Every apartment can be room 302 if the conditions align. Every home can transform from sanctuary to cell. That insight, that horror isn't just in haunted mansions or fog-covered towns, but in the spaces we think we control. Is Silent Hill 4's lasting gift to horror gaming? The room is everywhere. The chains appear when you least expect them, and sometimes when you're alone in your apartment late at night, you might hear that sound, the static crackling from a radio that shouldn't be there, warning that something is near.